The Mafia King of New York returned to his iron-gated estate 3 hours ahead of schedule, and the silence he expected was shattered by a sound that nearly brought him to his knees. It was a high, melodic trill, a child's laughter, rippling through the heavy afternoon heat. The sound was so foreign, so impossible, that Vincent Wild felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been struck by a physical blow. The handmade alligator skin briefcase, carrying documents worth more than most small countries, slipped from his fingers and hit the manicured lawn with a thud he was too stunned to hear. The man whose very name made the 5 families tremble stood paralyzed, unable to reconcile his reality with the scene unfolding before him. There, in the center of the garden, bathed in the sharp glare of the midday sun, was his 5-year-old son, Ethan. This was the same boy that 12 of the world's most elite specialists had declared emotionally dead, a child who hadn't reacted to a human face since the fire that claimed his mother. Yet, there was Ethan, his small face bright with a radiant, toothy grin, perched precariously on the back of a woman crawling through the grass. That woman wasn't the high-priced, Ivy League-educated child psychologist Vincent had on payroll. It was Eve Newton, the invisible housemaid he'd hired only weeks ago. Vincent had never spared her more than a cold glance, but now, he couldn't look away. She was on all fours, her blue uniform damp with sweat and her white apron smeared with dirt. Her bright yellow rubber gloves flashed in the sun as she mimicked the movements of a playful horse, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she was breaking every sterile contact protocol in the Wild mansion. Ethan clung to her neck, his laughter ringing out like a bell, a sound Vincent hadn't heard in 3 agonizing years. 3 years of watching his heir stare at blank walls with hollow eyes. 3 years of experts explaining that the trauma had rewired the boy's brain into a permanent state of catatonia. Vincent had spent a fortune on the most advanced neurotherapies money could buy, yet a girl in a cheap uniform and $2 rubber gloves was achieving a miracle that his millions could not touch. The weight of the custom-made Glock tucked beneath his $20,000 charcoal suit suddenly felt like a leaden anchor, pulling at his shoulder. Vincent Wild, a man who had stared down the barrels of rival hitmen without flinching, was now rooted to the spot like a statue. The contrast was a jagged blade, his cold, gold-trimmed power against the messy, vibrant warmth of a girl who had dared to touch what the world called broken. As he watched Eve's mud-stained knees and Ethan's reaching arms, a single, terrifying question ignited in Vincent's mind. If his son could laugh, then who had spent 3 years convincing him that the boy was a ghost? The heavy silence that followed the thud of Vincent's briefcase was more deafening than a gunshot. Eve froze mid-crawl, her body locking up as the shadow of the Mafia King stretched across the grass like a dark omen. Ethan, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, tightened his small arms around Eve's neck, his laughter dying into a wary whimper. Slowly, Eve pushed herself up from the dirt, her bright yellow rubber glove stained with streaks of mud and crushed clover. She didn't stand, she remained on her knees, a position of forced humility that did nothing to hide the defiant spark in her eyes. Vincent approached, each step of his polished Oxfords grinding into the gravel with predatory precision. "Explain," Vincent commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He gestured sharply at the child, the son who was supposed to be a statue of stone, and then at Eve's hands. The specialists were clear. No physical play. No overstimulation. High-frequency isolation was the only way to manage his condition. You were hired to clean, Eve, not to play doctor with a broken child. Eve took a trembling breath, but she didn't look down. "He isn't broken, Mr. Wild. He's just lonely." Vincent's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near the gold watch on his wrist. "You've been here 3 weeks. You think you know more than the best neurologists in the country? You're a maid. You were given strict orders, no contact." "I tried to follow them," Eve whispered, her voice gaining strength as she looked at Ethan, who was now hiding his face in her shoulder. "But 4 nights ago, I was scrubbing the baseboards in the hall. I heard him. It wasn't a scream or a fit like the nurses described. It was a sob. A soft, rhythmic sound that broke my heart." She glanced up at Vincent, her gaze cutting through his cold exterior. I went into his room against the rules. He was crying in his sleep, his little hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was reaching for something that wasn't there. I realized then that all your money had bought him was a very expensive cage. He didn't need a sedative or a specialist. He needed a horse to ride and someone to tell him it's okay to be loud. She lifted her yellow-gloved hands, the cheap latex catching the sun. I wore these because I was supposed to be cleaning the nursery, but when he saw the bright color, he actually looked at me. Not through me, but at me. He reached for the glove. So, I reached back. If that's a crime in this house, then you can fire me, but don't you dare tell me he can't feel. Vincent stood rooted, the air around him thick with the scent of cut grass and old lies. For the first time in years, the Mafia king felt the foundation of his empire tremble, not from a rival's threat, but from the simple, terrifying truth held in a pair of $2 gloves. The heavy silence of the garden followed Vincent back into the cold, marble depths of the mansion. Eve's words had planted a seed of suspicion that burned more fiercely than any street war he had ever fought. If Ethan wasn't broken, then he was being suppressed. Vincent retreated to his private study, the room where he orchestrated New York's underworld, but today, his focus wasn't on rival territories. It was on a small, silver tray sitting on the sideboard, Ethan's afternoon snack, prepared personally by the head of security's specialized staff. According to the experts, the boy required a strict, chemically balanced diet to manage his violent outbursts. Vincent looked at the bowl of organic fruit puree and the glass of fortified juice. To any other father, it looked like health, to a man who lived by the rule of the shadows, it looked like a weapon. Without a word to his staff, Vincent took a sample of the food and summoned a private chemist, a man who owed his life to the Wild family and asked no questions. "I need a full panel," Vincent whispered into the phone, his voice like grinding stones. "Now." 2 hours later, the report arrived via an encrypted link. Vincent's eyes scanned the results, and for the first time in his life, his hands shook. The food was saturated with a synthetic compound known in the black market as gray mist, a powerful sedative and neuroinhibitor designed to induce long-term lethargy and cognitive fog. It didn't cure autism, it mimicked it. It turned a vibrant child into a ghost, locking them inside their own mind until their muscles wasted and their spirit broke. The realization hit Vincent with the force of a physical explosion. This wasn't a medical tragedy, it was a slow-motion assassination. His son hadn't been lost to a fire or a diagnosis, he was being buried alive in his own home. He stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. He saw Eve in the distance, walking toward the servants' quarters, her yellow gloves tucked into her apron. She was the only person in this fortress who hadn't been feeding the lie. Every doctor, every guard, and every trusted advisor had looked him in the eye and lied while they systematically poisoned his legacy. Vincent felt the cold, familiar numbness of his Mafia persona settle over him, but this time it was different. This wasn't business. This was a father's vengeance. He reached into his desk and pulled out a burner phone, dialing his most loyal enforcer. "Marcus," Vincent said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I want a total surveillance sweep on my brother's private accounts and the medical staff. Don't leave a single stone unturned. I want to know who is buying the poison that's being fed to my son." The war had started, and this time, the Mafia king was burning his own kingdom to the ground. The digital trail Marcus uncovered didn't just lead to a pharmacy, it led to the family's inner sanctum. Vincent sat in the dark of his study, the blue light of the laptop screen carving deep, hollow shadows into his face. He scrolled through a mountain of encrypted medical invoices and wire transfers, his eyes burning as a recurring signature appeared on every document. It wasn't the signature of a doctor or a trustee. It was the sharp, arrogant script of Julian Wild, his own younger brother. Julian had always been the softer, Wild, the one who handled the family's legitimate fronts and philanthropic ventures while Vincent handled the blood and the iron. He was the one who had sat by Vincent's side at the funeral of Ethan's mother, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder and whispering that they would get the boy the best care money could buy. That comfort now felt like the cold slither of a snake. Vincent pulled up a hidden ledger. Over the last 3 years, millions of dollars had been funneled through a shell corporation into the accounts of the specialists who had diagnosed Ethan. Every check was signed by Julian. Every emergency medical update that claimed Ethan was worsening coincided with a massive withdrawal from the family's primary trust, funds that Julian was slowly siphoning off while Vincent was buried in grief and business. A heavy, suffocating realization settled in Vincent's chest. Julian hadn't just been stealing money, he had been stealing a child's life to ensure Vincent remained a distracted, broken leader. By keeping the heir incapacitated, Julian was positioning himself as the only stable successor to the Wild Empire. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, a rhythmic, confident click of Italian leather on marble. Vincent's grip tightened on the edge of his mahogany desk. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Julian stepped in, silhouetted by the hall light. He looked every bit the concerned brother, holding 2 glasses of aged scotch. "Still working, Vince?" Julian asked, his voice smooth and sympathetic. "You look tired. You should rest." "I just checked on Ethan, the nurses said he had another episode today. They've increased his dosage to keep him comfortable." Vincent looked at his brother, seeing for the first time the predatory greed hidden behind the mask of concern. He felt the weight of the Glock in his desk drawer, but he didn't move. He needed to play the game a little longer. He needed to see how far the rot went. "Comfortable," Vincent repeated, his voice a low, chilling rasp. "Yes. I'm sure that's exactly what he is." Julian smiled, a thin, oily expression that didn't reach his eyes. As he set the scotch down, Vincent noticed the shadow Julian cast across the floor, a long, distorted shape that looked like a shroud. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was a ghost haunting the very halls of his home, and Vincent knew that before the week was over, that shadow would have to be erased in blood. That night, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum of secrets. Vincent sat in the surveillance hub, a soundproof room buried in the basement, surrounded by a wall of monitors. His eyes were fixed on a grainy, low-light feed of the nursery. On the screen, the door creaked open. It wasn't Julian or the white-coated nurses with their trays of chemical submission. It was Eve. She had discarded the yellow gloves, but she still wore the blue uniform that marked her as lesser. She moved through the room with a quiet reverence, avoiding the squeaky floorboards with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her life trying not to be noticed. Vincent watched as she sat on the edge of Ethan's bed. To his shock, his son didn't flinch. Instead, the boy shifted, seeking the warmth of her presence. Eve began to sing. It wasn't a complex melody, just a soft, haunting lullaby that seemed to knit the fractured air of the room back together. As she stroked Ethan's hair, she began to talk to him in a hushed whisper, unaware that the king was listening. "You're safe now, little bird," she murmured. "The shadows can't get you tonight. I know the big man in the suit is scary. I know he looks at you and sees a broken clock he can't fix with his diamonds. But he's just a man who forgot how to breathe." Vincent flinched as if struck. He leaned closer to the monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs. "He's built a cage of gold and iron," Eve continued, her voice thick with a weary pity. "He thinks he's protecting you, but he's just a monster guarding a treasure he doesn't know how to love. He's so busy being the king of the city that he doesn't realize his own son is the only kingdom worth having." On the screen, Ethan reached out and took Eve's hand, lacing his small fingers through hers. It was a simple gesture of trust that Vincent hadn't received in years. Seeing it through the cold lens of a security camera made the Mafia king feel like a ghost haunting his own life. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of the monitor, the sharp jaw, the eyes hardened by 1,000 cruel decisions, the rings that symbolized power built on fear. Through Eve's eyes, he saw the truth. He wasn't a protector. He was the wall that kept the light out. He was the monster in the hall. As Eve leaned down to kiss Ethan's forehead, Vincent felt a hot, unfamiliar sting in his eyes. He had spent millions on experts, but this girl, with her dirt-stained knees and her simple songs, was the only one who had dared to see the boy behind the ghost. He realized then that if he wanted to save his son, he couldn't just kill his enemies. He had to kill the man he had become. The morning sun had barely begun to burn through the New York mist when Julian stepped into Vincent's office, his face a mask of practiced, fraternal panic. He didn't wait for an invitation. Instead, he slammed a small, high-tech recording device and a grainily photographed dossier onto the mahogany desk. "I tried to tell myself I was wrong, Vince," Julian breathed, his voice trembling with a calculated mix of fear and betrayal. "I tried to trust your judgment when you brought that girl into this house. But my security team flagged a signal coming from the servants' quarters. This was hidden in the vent of Eve Newton's room." Vincent looked down at the tiny, blinking wire, his heart turning to a block of ice. He didn't look at his brother, he looked at the dossier. It contained a series of staged photos, Eve standing near a black sedan in the city, Eve speaking to a man in a nondescript suit, and a forged transcript of a meeting with an FBI field agent. "She's an informant, Vince," Julian hissed, leaning over the desk, his shadow eclipsing the light. "She isn't here for the cleaning, and she certainly isn't here for Ethan. She's been using the boy to get close to you. She's building a RICO case from inside our own walls. The miracle you think you saw in the garden? It's a performance. She's softening you up so the bureau can move in for the kill." The air in the room became stifling. Every instinct Vincent possessed, the hardened, cold-blooded reflexes that had kept him alive in the underworld, screamed at him to react. In the Mafia world, an informant was a death sentence. Julian was handing him the gun, waiting for him to pull the trigger. "She's been asking about the medical shipments, hasn't she?" Julian pushed, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. "She's been trying to turn you against the medical staff because they're the only ones who can verify how dangerous Ethan's condition really is. She wants us divided, Vince. She's the reason the feds are at our doorstep." Vincent picked up the wire, his rings catching the dim light. He thought of the lullaby he'd heard through the monitors. He thought of the way Ethan had held Eve's hand, a gesture no FBI agent could coach, a warmth no wire could record. He looked at Julian and saw the desperation beneath the performance. Julian wasn't just trying to remove a maid, he was trying to erase the only witness to his own crimes. "I see," Vincent said, his voice a flat, terrifying monotone. He looked up at his brother, his eyes as unreadable as black glass. "If she's a rat, she'll be dealt with. I'll handle the interrogation myself. Nobody touches her until I get the truth." Julian nodded, a thin, triumphant smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully redirected the king's wrath. But as Julian turned to leave, Vincent's grip tightened on the wire until the plastic cracked. The trap was set, but it wasn't Eve who was walking into it. The shadows in Vincent's study were long and jagged, stretching across the floor like the teeth of a trap. He sat behind his heavy desk, the light of a single desk lamp casting his face into a mask of harsh angles and cold resolve. When the door opened and Eve was ushered in by two stone-faced guards, the air in the room seemed to freeze. She looked small, her blue uniform wrinkled and her hands, now stripped of their yellow gloves, trembling slightly at her sides. Vincent didn't ask her to sit. He let the silence stretch until the tension was a physical weight. "My brother found a wire in your room, Eve," he began, his voice a low, predatory rasp that had broken stronger men. He tossed the device onto the desk, where it skittered across the wood. "He says you're a rat. He says the FBI is using you to get to me, and that your interest in my son is nothing more than a play for leverage." He stood up, his tall frame looming over her, the gold of his rings glinting in the dim light. "I've ended lives for less than a whisper of betrayal. Give me one reason why I shouldn't hand you over to my men right now." Eve looked at the wire, then up at the man the world called a monster. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. With a hand that had finally stopped shaking, she smoothed it out and placed it on the desk, right next to the recording device. "I don't know anything about wires, Mr. Wild," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I know about this. I found it under Ethan's pillow this morning." Vincent looked down. It wasn't a confession or a list of names. It was a drawing, crude, shaky lines of crayon on a piece of scrap paper. It depicted 3 figures standing on a bright green lawn. One was a tall man in a black box of a suit, one was a girl with yellow circles for hands, and between them, a smaller figure holding both of their hands. In the corner, a jagged yellow sun spilled light over all of them. The doctor said his fine motor skills were gone. They said he couldn't conceptualize family, Eve whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But he drew you, Vincent. He drew you standing with us. He didn't draw a mafia king. He drew a father." The air left Vincent's lungs. He stared at the drawing, the first sign of creative life from his son in 3 years, and felt the cold, iron armor around his heart shatter. The wire was a lie, a piece of plastic meant to blind him, but the drawing was a truth he couldn't ignore. He realized then that Julian hadn't just framed a maid, he had tried to murder the only hope Vincent had of ever being human again. He looked at Eve, seeing not a servant or a suspect, but the woman who had walked into a lion's den to save a cub. "Go to the nursery," Vincent said, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. "Stay with him. Don't let anyone in. I have to go deal with a ghost." The transition from the study to the garden felt like stepping from a freezer into a furnace. Vincent had barely cleared the estate gates for a tactical meet with Marcus when the afternoon's peace was shattered. From the tree lane, 3 black SUVs roared onto the white gravel, the rhythmic crunch of tires sounding like a death knell. These weren't Julian's polished security guards, these were cleaners, faceless men in tactical gear sent to erase every witness to the Wild family's shame. In the nursery, Eve heard the first crack of a suppressed rifle. It wasn't the loud, cinematic explosion she expected, but a sharp thud that shattered a decorative vase by the window. She didn't scream. Her time with Ethan had taught her that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Ethan, look at me," she whispered, her voice a steel thread of calm. The boy was staring at the broken glass, his small body beginning to tremble as the old, dark memories of the fire threatened to resurface. Eve grabbed his hand, her grip firm and grounding. "We're playing a new game. It's called the Ghost Walk. We have to be silent, or the Seekers win. Can you do that for me?" Ethan nodded, his eyes wide and trusting. Outside, the sounds of heavy boots thudded against the porch. The mansion's internal alarms had been silenced, another gift from Julian, leaving them alone in the vast, echoing fortress. Eve didn't head for the stairs, she knew the exits would be covered. Instead, she pressed her palm against the mahogany wainscoting behind the toy chest, feeling for the hidden catch Vincent had mentioned during his interrogation. With a soft click, a section of the wall receded. It was a narrow, dimly lit passage leading to the estate's heart, the panic room. As they slipped inside, the nursery door was kicked off its hinges. Eve held her breath, peering through the one-way visual slit in the reinforced wood. She saw the barrel of a rifle sweep the room. One of the men, a giant with a scarred neck, stepped toward the bed. "The kid's gone," the man growled into his radio. "Find the girl. Julian wants them both buried under the patio before the boss gets back." Eve's blood ran cold. The betrayal wasn't just a financial scheme, it was a massacre. She pulled Ethan deeper into the shadows of the panic room, the heavy steel door sealing with a pressurized hiss that cut off the world. They were safe behind 6 inches of reinforced plating, but as she watched the monitors, she saw the hit squad moving toward the garden, trampling the very grass where Ethan had laughed only hours before. She clutched Ethan to her chest, the boy's heart beat a rapid drum against her ribs. She had no gun, no power, and no way out. All she had was a hidden room and the hope that the man the world called a monster was on his way back to save the only heaven he had left. The roar of the custom engine cut through the silence of the estate like a war cry. Vincent didn't wait for the gates to fully swing open. He drove the armored sedan straight through the iron bars, the screech of tearing metal announcing his arrival. He hadn't come back as the Mafia king to negotiate a territory or discuss a bottom line. He had come back as a father whose sanctuary had been defiled. As he stepped out of the car, the first of Julian's hitmen emerged from the foyer, rifle leveled. Vincent didn't flinch. His movements were a blur of lethal, practiced efficiency. Before the man could find his trigger, a single shot from Vincent's Glock found its mark. He moved through the garden with the cold, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. Every shadow that moved was met with a calculated strike. He wasn't just clearing a house, he was purging a plague. Julian. Vincent's voice thundered, echoing off the marble pillars of the veranda. It was a sound stripped of all humanity, a raw vibration of pure, unadulterated wrath. He found the second squad near the nursery wing. They were professional killers, but they were used to fighting men who valued their lives. They weren't prepared for a man who had already decided that the world could burn as long as his son was safe. Vincent moved through the crossfire with a terrifying lack of regard for his own safety, his eyes fixed on the door where he had last seen Eve and Ethan. He dismantled the tactical team with a cold-blooded precision that made even the hardened mercenaries hesitate. To them, he looked like a demon rising from the very hell they had tried to create. He cornered the lead gunman, the scarred man who had threatened to bury a child, near the stone fountain. Vincent didn't use his gun. He dropped the weapon and used his bare hands, his rings drawing blood as he forced the man to his knees. There was no mercy in his grip, only the crushing weight of 3 years of stolen laughter. "Where are they?" Vincent hissed, his face inches from the man's. "Tell me, or I will ensure you spend the rest of your very short life wishing for death." The man pointed a trembling finger toward the nursery wall. Vincent didn't wait for a confession. He stood, his chest heaving, his suit jacket torn and stained with the evidence of his violence. He turned toward the hidden panel, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no gunfight had ever caused. "Eve! Ethan!" he shouted, his voice breaking through the frost of his anger. He wasn't the king anymore. He was just a man terrified that he was too late. When the panel finally buzzed and clicked open, and he saw Eve's wide, amber eyes peering out from the dark, Vincent felt a sensation he hadn't known since the fire. He felt the ice in his soul begin to melt. He reached out, his blood-stained hand trembling as he pulled them into the light. He had won the war, but as he felt Ethan's small arms wrap around his neck, he realized the real battle, the one for his son's future, was only just beginning. The smoke from the fire in the stone hearth rose straight and gray, carrying with it the remains of a 3-year nightmare. One by one, Vincent fed the thick medical dossiers into the flames, the false diagnoses, the forged invoices, and the expert opinions that had acted as the bars of his son's prison. As the ink curled and blackened, the heavy weight of the Mafia King title seemed to burn away with them. Julian had been exiled, stripped of his name and sent to face the family's tribunal in the shadows, but Vincent no longer cared for the politics of the underworld. His focus was on the sun-drenched hallway where the iron-toed boots of his security detail no longer echoed. He had dismissed them all, the guards who had looked the other way, the nurses who had administered the gray mist, and the advisors who had chosen gold over loyalty. The fortress was finally empty, and for the first time, it felt like a home. Vincent found Eve in the nursery, though she wasn't cleaning. She was sitting on the floor, helping Ethan stack wooden blocks, a simple task that, weeks ago, had been deemed a medical impossibility. The bright yellow rubber gloves were gone, replaced by the warmth of her bare hands as she guided the boy's fingers. As Vincent entered, Ethan didn't shrink away. He looked up, his eyes clear and vibrant, and offered a shy, toothy smile. "Dad," the boy whispered, the word still new and fragile, but stronger than any contract Vincent had ever signed. Vincent knelt beside them, the expensive fabric of his trousers pressing into the rug. He looked at Eve, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes but also a fierce, quiet joy. She began to stand, smoothing out her blue uniform, her habit of invisibility returning. "I'll go finish the laundry, Mr. Wild. I'm sure you want some time alone with him." "No," Vincent said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer sought to hide. He reached out and caught her hand, the hand that had reached for his son when he was too blind to do so. "The laundry can wait. In fact, Eve, I don't want you to touch a cleaning cloth in this house ever again." Eve's breath hitched, her eyes searching his. Am I being let go?" "I'm firing the maid," Vincent said, a small, genuine smile breaking the hardness of his face. "But I am asking the woman who saved my son to stay. Not for the wages, and not for the work. Stay because this house has been a tomb for too long, and you are the only one who knows how to bring the light back into it." He looked at the drawing on the desk, the three figures holding hands under a jagged yellow sun. The walls of the Wild Empire were still standing, but the walls around Vincent's heart had finally fallen. He wasn't just a king anymore, he was a father, and as he watched Eve pull Ethan into a hug, he knew he had finally found the only kingdom worth ruling. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family strength, a life full of joy and peace every day. See you again in the next video.